So I had a longtime friend reach out to me and ask me if I could look at their string trimmer, and of course I said yes. They said it was a real pain to start when cold and figured that it needed a tune-up. But when they told me which one it was, I sort of lost that enthusiasm, but for good reason. When talking about a 4-cycle trimmer, they can get a bit complicated to work on, as you're about to see. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this troy-bilt string trimmer, and the problem is that according to my friend, it needs a tune-up, and the reason why is because it's really tough to start when it's cold. So here's the strange part. They said it runs just fine, but to get it to start, they have to give it a shot of starting fluid. Without it, starting a cold engine is impossible, and yet when the engine is hot, it'll start back up with no issues whatsoever. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. If you didn't know this, 4-cycle trimmers were supposed to make owning and using a string trimmer a lot easier by skipping the part where you have to mix the oil and gasoline. What they didn't tell you was that it was a trade-off in more maintenance, and this one is more than likely a victim of the same problem. And the most neglected part of the maintenance is checking the valve clearances, which can greatly affect how the engine starts and runs. Now there is one giant red flag that happens to be a neon color, and that is the zip tie holding the air filter cover to the engine. We'll come back to this important piece of the puzzle, but right now I'm more concerned about trying to start the engine and showing you the problem firsthand. Just remember to follow the starting instructions, and that's because they may not be what you're used to. I know that looked terrible, but for some reason the rope is a lot harder to pull over than usual. But this is a good sign that the valve lash could be out of tolerance and needs to be adjusted. And after removing the oil plug, I can see that there's plenty of oil in the engine, which is great news, but as part of good maintenance, we will be changing it. So after taking off the air filter cover, I can see why they had the zip ties on it. The air filter base is extremely weak and it's not able to keep its shape, so it's flexing and allowing the cover to fall off. So this time I'll prime the engine with some fuel and then try starting it again and see if we get a better result. So we did get it to start up this time, but will it start back up without any help? So the problem is exactly how they described it. Starts and runs when hot, but getting it started when cold is the main issue. Now, having old gasoline in the fuel tank might be part of the problem, but this gasoline looks good, so we'll move on with the maintenance. So what I'm going to do is take off the engine cover so that we can eventually check the valve clearances. We're also going to pour out the oil while it's still warm from our test start so we can replace it later on with new oil. I'm also planning on taking the carb apart for an inspection, and I'm mainly looking to see if the diaphragms are beginning to harden up. I then took off the carb and noticed that it was in really good condition for being as old as it was. And after talking to my friend about it, come to find out they had replaced the carb last year, which means I was very certain that the carb was not the problem. However, a loose intake insulator might be part of the problem. Now, one bolt was a bit loose, but it wasn't bad enough to cause this problem. Next, we'll take out the spark plug to make turning the engine over a bit easier, but we might as well inspect it as well. But it turns out that the spark plug looked very new as well. I then came to the conclusion that with the condition of the fuel lines, carb, and spark plug, they tried to do a tune-up last year, but it didn't really fix their problem. Unfortunately, I don't think they were aware of the importance of checking the valve clearances, so that's what we're going to do next. So to start off, I'm going to rotate the engine so that one of the rocker arms is all the way down while the other one is loose. We'll then check the clearance for the loose one. So I like to set my clearances to 5/1000ths of an inch, but before I adjust them, I want to see how far the clearance has gotten. So after sliding the feeler into the clearance, it turns out to be much too loose in there. But after trying different shims, we then find out that it's about 10/1000ths of an inch in clearance, which isn't too bad. Next, we'll rotate the engine so that the loose rocker arm is all the way down, while the other one is now the loose one. We'll then do the very same process as before, and it turns out this one is not as bad as the other one, but I'm still going to adjust it. Next, we'll take out the 5/1000 feeler gauge, slide it into the clearance, and then turn the adjusting nut clockwise to reduce the clearance between the rocker arm and the top of the valve. We want to make it so that the feeler gauge just barely drags in the clearance. But if you turn it too much and it does get stuck, then turn the nut counterclockwise a bit to loosen it. After you set the clearance for the first rocker arm, rotate the engine again and then set the clearance for the last one. Now there was one more thing that my friend wanted me to do with this trimmer that they weren't able to do. They wanted me to check the health of the engine by doing a compression test. The tester will screw into the spark plug opening, and after pulling on the rope several times, will measure how much pressure the engine can make. Now the reason they couldn't check it was because they didn't have this adapter since the spark plug was a different size. Also, before I forget, I want to put the new oil back into the engine. Remember that this engine doesn't take more than 3 ounces, so just be careful not to overfill it. Once there's enough oil in it, we'll then do a compression test. So the reading is a not so great 100 psi, which is quite low, however it's not terrible. What this means is that this engine has quite a bit of wear on it, but it should still be quite usable for a couple of years. Of course, that's dependent upon the future oil changes and making sure that it's not neglected at the same time. Now, I didn't ask about the past maintenance on this machine, but from everything that I've seen so far, it's sort of hit or miss. They've done the basics and a bit of intermediate stuff, but as with most consumers, they're not comfortable going beyond the basics, and I totally understand. Now, if you're curious, the intermediate stuff they did on this machine was their choice to only use 100% gasoline, which was very smart of them. Now, before I put the engine cover back on, I want to do one more thing, and that is to inspect the spark arrestor screen. I want to see if it's clogged with carbon, and if it is, we'll then need to take it out and clean it. But as you can tell, you can see right through this one, meaning there's hardly any carbon buildup on it. Now, if the screen was clogged with carbon, then it would affect how the engine runs because the exhaust gases can't escape the muffler. Now, there really wasn't a need to take off the fuel tank, but with the engine cover off, it was the only thing helping to hold it in place. I've tried dealing with a loose tank before, but it really does get in the way, so taking it off is just easier. So if you're not checking the valve clearances or the spark arrestor screen, then I wouldn't take off the fuel tank. So when connecting the fuel lines back to the carb, the fuel filter line will connect to the port closer to the purge bulb. That only leaves us with the return line, which connects to the lower port, which happens to be straight. Before we put gasoline into the tank, I do want to check the condition of the fuel filter and the line. If the fuel filter is missing, it means that unfiltered gasoline was making it to the carb, which could clog the inlet screen. A clogged inlet screen will hamper the amount of fuel that the carb can deliver, so if your trimmer isn't running, check the fuel filter. Now that we've got the trimmer back together again, it's time to purge the air from the lines, choke the carb, and then try starting it. So unfortunately it did not start, but this is when I realized something. Remember how weak the plastic was on the air filter base? Well, what if the plastic was deformed around the flap for the choke as well? If it is deformed and letting air go by it, it basically means the choke is not going to work like it should. And as you can see, there's a sizable gap at the bottom edge of the choke flap and is allowing a lot of air to leak past, making the choke not work like it should. Now the reason for this gap and deformation around the choke is because of how weak the plastic is. And even though I could come up with something to make the choke flap seal better, I think the better idea would be to replace it, although there is a very slim chance that even the new one might be the same way. Now if it is, then I'll just send it back and do the fix that I didn't want to do in the first place. So here's the new one that I ordered, and on first impression I'd have to rate it a 7 out of 10 in rigidity, while the original one would have been a low 3 out of 10. So what would a solid 10 out of 10 look like then? Well, it would have to be made from the same plastic as the engine cover we took off earlier. As you can see, there is no flex in the choke flap like there was on the other one. That means it's flush with the opening and should make the choke system work like it's supposed to. That's one of the main reasons why working on trimmers can be so challenging. It's not just about fuel, compression, and spark, but instead almost everything in the system has to be working well too. Otherwise, something as simple as a choke flap not sealing well could cause you to despise a machine like this one. Even having this emissions hose disconnected might be enough to cause the engine to run a bit differently, not enough to keep you from using it, but it's still affecting it. And if I put the videos side by side, you can see the plastic is not flexing as much as the old one was. And because it's not flexing, the flap is now sealing a whole lot better, meaning we should be able to start this trimmer without any issues now. So as you just saw, aside from a slight idle speed adjustment, this trimmer now starts and runs just like it should. So what did we learn from this project? Well, most times the carb is the problem, except this time. Now this time it was something as mundane as cheap soft plastics causing our problem. Sometimes it takes more than just replacing or rebuilding a carb, replacing the fuel lines and any other parts that you would think would have an important role to play. This time it was something so far out of the box most would have never considered it. I surely didn't. So my question is, have you ever ran into a situation like this, where the cause was something so strange that no one would ever believe you?
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.